at some of the basic stuff for becoming a hybrid church, which obviously a class like this is a prime example of what hybrid has done to the church. An event like this 2 years ago would have been unlikely to have been conceived of. Not enough people would have been familiar with Zoom, even though Zoom would have been capable of doing this 2 years ago. The church really wouldn't have had its kind of head around it. So it's in many ways changed everything about church that we will allow it to change in terms of how we do things. And that includes continuing education. And I think synods, I'm doing a thing with the Conference of Bishops next Thursday. And I think synods, especially judicatories, if you're in other traditions beside the ELCA, should really be thinking about this for continuing education, connecting, meeting, because there's so many things that we can do beyond parish ministry where this facilitates even a better platform because of the reality that geography is a big deal for a lot of things. Cost is a big deal. Time is a big deal, but it impacts congregational ministry too. And what I've discovered over the last few years in various ways, and then through the pandemic in some fairly intensive ways, are that if the church is kind of on the front end of this in terms of application, which there's no reason it can't be, that we can do a lot of things better than we did before the pandemic, or differently in ways that are just as good, but more efficient. And the church can do some incredible work that it really wouldn't have conceived of not that long ago. So I'm really glad to be here today, and I'm glad to be here with Craig as a host. He's a great colleague. Craig has done some great work in his parish in a number of ways, and I'm sure those of you in the class have benefited from some of those stories as well. I'm going to share some slides today during this first hour and share some material that's there. If anybody's interested in the book, you can go to the website, Day 8 Strategies. I'll show the slide at the end. But if you type in workshop on the coupon thing, you get 10% off. And if you buy bulks, it's cheaper and things. So get it as cheap as you can. I don't make that much money off of books anyway. But if it's helpful and this book is proving to be, then grab it and feel fine with that. I'm going to put my slides up now and share a few things. And you may find that depending on screen view that this will change things again anyway. So adjust accordingly. I think one of the things that's important to remember about being a hybrid church, and there's my website there at the bottom under my name, where you can get the book. You can get it on Amazon also, and it's on Kindle as well, is that the church's purpose really hasn't changed at all just because the church has gone through this pandemic. And of course, this isn't God's first pandemic. Luther experienced pandemic kinds of things even in his own lifetime. So the Reformation had a pandemic in the middle of it. The plague was a big deal in Europe and came and went frequently through communities. But the mission of the church that God is calling it to isn't changing because the mechanisms are changing or the context changing. So I love this passage, in part because of the I don't know or I can't tell you answer that Jesus has to give. This is the disciples right before the ascension. They said, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? And they're thinking restoration. Okay, is a glory day finally going to be put back? And Jesus replied, it's not for you to know the times or periods the Father set by his own authority. Imagine this is your last question you get to ask Jesus, and the answer is, I can't tell you. I have to leave you just as in the dark as you were when you asked the question. But then he says, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. And this hasn't changed. In fact, some of the mechanisms for doing this are different, but some of them are more effective than they were before. The other text, which was one that many of you used perhaps not that long ago, because it's an Easter text from the lectionary, is from John 20. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And after this, he showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they're forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. So what you see right away in this is that God is entrusting and expecting and empowering the church to do the work of Jesus, and that we continue this work in important ways throughout our ministry as the church. And this missional focus, that we're empowered by the Spirit, that we're sent by Jesus, that we're called to witness and carry out Christ's work of witnessing, of healing, of proclaiming good news, of forgiving sins, of reconciling. These kinds of things don't go away, even if the things that we're used to using as a mechanism do. So as you think about congregational life, one of the things that I think as we live out this mission in this identity is to remember that every congregation has to be figuring out how to develop itself inward and move itself outward. That if you don't do either of these things, you're in a mess. If you only do one of them, you still got a problem. And it really takes both of these to be the church in all of its fullness. That there's an inward dimension where the church is called to be a community where people love and are being loved and able to love each other. And that they're also being equipped. The word equipping the saints, that phrase in Ephesians, they're deepening their faith. They're being shaped as disciples to look and follow and be maturing into the image of Christ. And they're serving and living out their identity as the body of Christ, where each person matters and is part of what God's up to. At the same time, if the congregational life is only inward focused and focuses on our people, our members, our church, whatever that language is, and doesn't work its way out, it fails to fulfill the purpose for which Christ called it, which was to be the body of Christ, not only for itself as an identity, but for the world as a ministry, as a mission. So our work is to mobilize people, to equip people, to send people. And that as we continue the ministry of Jesus, we literally are Christ for the world in the kind of a mystical way that Christ identifies with the church. So an online reality, a hybrid reality, has to be conscious of how do we use these tools, skills, and new mindsets to develop our people and create loving and meaningful community. And how do we mobilize people to live out their vocations and to serve as the feet, hands, and voice in Christ together in the church? So I think this change is a really refreshing chance for us not only to look at hybrid reality, but to remember why we exist in the first place. And that's where I want to start, with this reality that we begin this work still as the church and being reminded of what it is. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Invitational Christian, and the first chapter of that book is why invite anybody to church? And the only two reasons are that either somebody coming into a congregational life will find their connection to God and their spiritual life deepened with a community of people and support, or it will be sent and equipped and feel like they're participating in something that's making a difference in the world in a way that brings joy to God. That this inward and outward dimension are really the only reasons for evangelism. Are you going to change someone's life, or are you going to mobilize people to be the continuing presence of Christ for the world? And that doesn't go away in this. So that's why we wrote this book. And as we go through this piece, one of the things that I want to talk about here is the Easter kind of splash that we had. The Easter splash was a year ago now, and there was news stories all over, problems in the news about Easter being canceled. Of course, Easter wasn't canceled. It wasn't really canceled, but that was what the news stories were. And because the news story said we're canceling Easter, people were very intrigued. And because the pandemic really came to a head less than a month before Easter, we only had 4 weeks notice, everybody was scrambling. And if you watched ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, public radio, public TV, Fox News, it didn't matter what your news source was, there was a lot of buzz about Easter and some buzz about even Passover, even though Judaism's much smaller, and what was going to happen in the church because of the pandemic. And something fascinating happened, that all of these newscasts and all of this buzz and all of this attention meant that the church got more free publicity and more advertising for last Easter than it really had ever received in history. And because we canceled worship on the ground and churches scrambled like crazy to figure out how to live stream or get something up, people were interested. And we actually have data-driven numbers to show that last Easter, Easter 2020, was the day that more people heard the gospel preached in in a single day than in any other day in the history of the world. And it hasn't been replaced since. This Easter was much smaller again. The splash of last Easter, though, meant that because we were only online and because we all pretty much canceled in the sanctuary, literally the world was paying attention, and it was so easy to check us out that they did. And I think it's fascinating that if you had said on Ash Wednesday, we're going to cancel all of our in sanctuary services for Easter and go online because we think we could reach the world with the message of Christ, that everybody would have thought that was just the stupidest thing possible. But even long after Ash Wednesday, halfway into Lent, we finally found out that was the only option. We scrambled, and what happened was quite remarkable. So I was actually quite surprised in a pleasant way at how well the church did that initial adaptation, how many congregational leaders scrambled to figure out how to push that Facebook Live button and get the camera on your laptop running, and what does it mean to stream, and all the things that go with it. And so I think a first lesson of this pandemic really is that it's easier to adapt when you have no choice except to do it. That the more crisis we find ourselves in, if something's important, the urgency of it will push us through it, and we will do things we would have thought were impossible, might have even opposed simply out of principle, maybe only 2 or 3 weeks earlier. And you can all probably in your own ministry, maybe even in your own heart, think of the shift that you had here as we went through this, and how much angst, how much you thought it was a good idea, how much excitement, how much pain. We all experienced a pretty wide range of emotions and thoughts as we went through this, but we all, for the most part, found ways to celebrate Easter in a way that we hadn't planned when Ash Wednesday started. So we've got some things happening that I think are really important, and they're not really pandemic related. The pandemic just accelerated it. First of all, the changing role of church in society. Pre-COVID, church has been on decline. Per capita participation in the church has actually been declining since 1951 in the United States. Raw numbers have been declining pretty steadily in many systems since the 60s, almost all systems since the 80s. And in the ELCA, which a high percentage of you are from, we've lost about half of our membership now since the merger when we formed our denomination in 1988. So we don't really know what our numbers coming out of the pandemic are, but it's estimated that we'll be about half the size we were 35 years ago. So a lot of this is already happening. Pandemic created this physical interruption. And so we had this extended time without gathering, and an extended time of using online tools. And many people think that the reality is that this pandemic really didn't break our system at all. It simply revealed how fragile it is. And I would speak for myself, the church that I pastor at as a congregation, when my wife, who's a deacon there, and I came, we job share 18 years ago now. It was in the process of closing. And we've done a lot of, I think, good work. I've been very blessed by the Spirit's presence and movement in that work. And our congregation is pretty strong today. It's a place, urban kind of an environment in Elgin. We have about 100 people a week on a typical week. Our finances actually last year were the strongest fiscal year we've ever had. We finished almost $50,000 in the black, which is very good for us, I can only say. And we did a lot of things differently. But I also know that in spite of that, my wife and I have a list of 7 things that could happen that we've kept. And I'd urge you all to, if you know your congregations well, to do this. List the things that if this happens or this happens, we could be in trouble, and be alert to them ahead. It might be if so-and-so dies, or if this family decides to move to be closer to grandchildren. And if you've had these conversations, you kind of know what's on mind. List all those things. We've got 7 things that could happen that could be significant hits to our resource base as a congregation. If any 3 of those happen in the same year, we're in serious trouble. If 2 of them happen, we got to scramble. We can take any one of them. We can deal with 2. At 3, if somebody dies and somebody moves in the same year, and they're the right givers, we're in serious trouble. So I'd urge you to think about your own system and your own resource base and know what's there, and be prepared for it and have contingency plans and ways to deal with it. Most of us are fragile places in congregational life. And even big places like Willow Creek ended up laying off dozens of people during the pandemic. So you think, oh, these big, huge systems, they got so much money. Well, they got big systems to operate. And whether you like or don't like Willow Creek, the fragility of Willow Creek between some pastoral scandal issues and some financial stuff from the pandemic shows that even huge resource-laden places can find themselves in trouble in a very short period of time. It's why it's so important for us as leaders to stay on top of stewardship, resource bases, ministry, keep our congregations focused on the right things, helping people grow and develop as disciples, mobilizing people to be Christ's presence in the world. The other thing we've got here is a lot of nostalgia. And nostalgia is always attractive because you can see the past and you can't see the future. So it's magnetizing. There's just something about it that makes us hungry for concreteness. But the reality is you can't go back. There's no way to go back to February of last year and simply sort of take up where you were. Everything is different. Everybody's experience and awareness is different. And you can only go forward. And one of the things that I want to encourage all of you as you think about this, as you go forward, be very intentional as you're putting things back. I know we've got a lot of parish pastors during this first hour. Put back as few things the way they were as you can. And that doesn't mean be resistant to putting things back that you should put back. But if you've stopped doing a ministry almost completely for a whole year, certain kinds of groups or activities or whatever, and that group hasn't found a way to function in the last 12 to 15 months, or that ministry hasn't found a way to continue, consider that it might be non-essential. And that rather than putting it back and saying, oh, we can restart that again, that you might use that same energy and creativity to do something different that's more appropriate for this post-pandemic world. Now, it's not to say that some things that were there before shouldn't come back in relatively similar form. You got to use your own contextual awareness and judgment. But don't be too quick to put everything back as much as possible the way it was, because all that energy is going to be used for something, and then it can't be used for something else. So this is a really good time as you're kind of inching back in to move slowly on restoration and move more creatively on implementation of some new things. So there's a lot of things happening, and most people, when they think of online worship, really think, or online ministry rather, really think of online worship. This is the thing that we scrambled to the most because we had to figure out Easter. But the reality is that the online church of the future will probably be doing far more than worship. And in many settings, worship may not even be an online priority. I don't know what it will be in your setting. I can show you what it will be in different settings. And I believe that there's a significant and important role for online worship post-pandemic, that we shouldn't all just fold up shop and say, okay, that got us through. Let's go back to on the ground only. But what online worship looks like in your place versus my place, or even my place compared to what it looks like now, I'll talk more about all the changes that you have to think about continuously. But there's a lot of other things about meetings and Bible studies and curriculum and congregational partnership and sharing, especially around discipleship and education. All these kinds of things are available to us. And it's possible that the most important online hybrid kinds of decisions you make won't be worship related long-term, but they will be related to some other aspect of your ministry around growing disciples and around meeting and making decisions and building relationships. The other thing to just keep reminding people, I keep hearing this word virtual ministry, virtual this. We're going to have a virtual meeting. I just want to try to eradicate that language, even though it's so popular, and replace it with online. Online is a real place, and meetings and things that happen there really happen. I'm still puzzled by this dynamic. If I were to call one of you on the phone and have a phone conversation, at the end of that phone conversation, if you were to report that, you'd say, hey, I just finished talking to Dave. You would never have said, I virtually talked to Dave, because we've internalized the technology of the phone enough that we don't think of it as a fake conversation that approximates a conversation in some way that's virtual. It's virtually a conversation, which means almost real. No, we would just say we had a conversation and talked. Somehow, because of how our brains function in new environments, if you take that same phone call and you add visuals to it to make it even more real, We think of it as virtual, that it's approximation, and virtual, I think, takes away, it really reduces our taking seriously that kind of an environment. So I'm really trying to say we're not having a virtual meeting, we're having an online meeting. Where are we meeting? We're meeting in the library. Where are we meeting? We're meeting in the classroom. Where are we meeting? We're meeting online. Think of it as a place, and it's a real place. And the education, the conversations, the decisions that we make in this very real place are very real. And the more we can internalize that, the more we'll be able to use this space well. And whether you're in the building, physically doing something, or whether you're online, the mission of God is the same. And if you ignore this new online world, you really do so at your peril. The flip side, and why I think there's so much interest in this topic right now, and my consulting work has gone kind of out the roof here with people, conversations about this are just everywhere, is that while last Easter was really pretty easy, and I mean that in terms of decision making, last Easter was pretty easy. You had one option. We had to figure out how to get online and have worship. Everybody could get behind it. Nobody knew enough to think about what was possible or not possible. Nobody was pushing and pulling in too many directions. Once it was decided you can't meet physically, then I guess we have to be online. That was very unifying. And in fact, we can track the stock of rostered leaders from March, April, May last year, and it went up in most settings. Most people thought their pastor, if he or she was kind of a doofus in February, if you got online and Easter happened, they thought you were much smarter than they thought by May 1st. It was amazing to see just the tone and the mood and the affirmation of people who didn't know how to get online, be shocked that their pastors figured out how to do it, and that there was a sermon for Easter and all the rest. So it was very unifying for the church. There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of adrenaline. This last Easter was much more conflicted. I'm going to tell a quick story about a pastor in a synod where the synod is pretty conflicted about this. It's in a fairly, has sort of a mid-sized city, has its largest population base, has a large rural base, and there's a lot of different mindsets, contexts, and environments there. And a congregation said to a pastor whose wife had a disability, was in a wheelchair, and was somewhat reduced in health things, and they had not had both their vaccines yet. The congregation said, either you do Easter in the sanctuary, or we're getting rid of you. And in my mind, to be honest, and I grew up in New York, so I have a little bit of a spiteful, shout and throw to kind of a mindset for people. The pastor who resigned, he said, I'm not putting my wife and my family at that kind of risk. She's too fragile, and if she gets this, we're probably going to lose her. I refuse. So he resigned. And he resigned the Wednesday or so, the week before Holy Week, so about 10 days before Easter. In my mind, he really blew it, because I think he should have waited to the Wednesday of Holy Week and resigned, and really just stuck it to him, because I think a group of people that's that unloving and that driven deserve more consequences. Now, I only half mean that, but that's the kind of tension we're seeing now. I'm working with a congregation in Pennsylvania at huge fights. Their entire leadership team didn't want to come back. 3/4 of the people said we're coming back anyway. They're running about 30% of what their attendance was before in 4 services. They're working their tails off, and they're tearing each other up. And there's a huge spike in their area in Pennsylvania right now, but they still won't stop. So the decisions now are much harder. People are tired. The option to be back is legal, whereas last year it was told you just don't do it, and everybody sort of did. The politics of this has gotten involved in it, and churches look remarkably like the rest of the world all too often. And so what I'm seeing now is pastors who are in a lot of stress, congregations who are arguing more, decisions that are much less unifying. Barna just did a piece that showed that 1 in 3 pastors have thought about quitting in the last 6 months. And that particular thing is not denominationally specific, and it's not quitting my church. It's actually, I'm just going to go do something else. It's too tiring. Retirement rates are up. And that whole process is just showing how stressful this is. I'm serving as an interim pastor at Holy Trinity Lutheran Church here in Elgin also. So I've got my own congregation, and I'm an interim. So I'm preaching 3 sermons on 2 sites on Sundays right now. And the stress over there is different. But part of the reason I'm there is because after 10 months or so, they still didn't have an interim. And I'm glad I'm there. I think it's coming together pretty helpful. But finding people to do interim work, retired pastors who are open to that, with the online environment, with the pandemic. So it's just a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety in our system this year that was adrenaline run through last year, and this year not so much. So I want to say a few things as we move into this. First of all, hybrid ministry is not online ministry. It takes on the ground work seriously too. I read a review of one of my books, or one of the reviews of my book rather, and one of the people said, "This is a pretty interesting book, but it assumes you're going to take over half your ministry online." I thought, well, gee, I don't see that. I don't think most congregations will take over half their ministry online, to be honest, and certainly won't take half of everything. But in this particular person's mind, once you were this serious about online, you had to ditch on the ground. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. I want to be really clear. Hybrid ministry takes on the ground work seriously. We're an incarnational church. We have incarnational theology. And so the fact that we're talking about doing things online doesn't mean we're not planning to do things on the ground. What hybrid ministry does is it takes on the ground work seriously, and it takes online work seriously, and it asks the question, where should we do this? Should we do it on the ground physically? Should we do it online, electronically, digitally? Or should we do both? And in many hybrid realities, it'll be both, where you're on the ground and online. And many congregations are now doing this with their worship life. They'll have an online worship, and they'll have physical in the sanctuary worship. In our case, that's what we have at the moment. Although we're suspending worship again this week because we're using a positivity rate benchmark, and we've crossed over that in the county where I live. But we had physical worship at 8:30 and 10:45. I had physical worship in another congregation at 9:30. And we had online worship, which in our case was a recorded service where we put all the pieces together and edited and built a live release on Facebook Live at 9:30. The other thing about this is that online worship isn't really new, in the sense of hybrid. Congregations have been doing hybrid in a small way for a long time. We just weren't really conscious of the huge and abruptness when we became aware of it. I can't tell you how many congregations now publish their newsletter primarily as a PDF and don't mail out printed ones. Or if they do, they print out a reduced number of printed ones to a certain subset of people who aren't electronically friendly, perhaps older people. Email communication, which has been pretty standard for a long time, part of hybrid ministry. Text messaging, part of hybrid ministry. So it's not like this is new. What happened was that the curve that we had, which was kind of trickling and inching along the way church usually changes, which is much slower than perhaps we could or should, was abruptly interrupted, and we were forced to take on a lot of online material in a quick period of time, and then move to many of our ministries to primarily digital environments. But most of this was happening anyway. And most church leaders and consultants, as they've looked at the trajectory, says that for the most part, what happened is the church got a 10-year lurch into the future. That the abruptness of this forced us to think about live streaming in places we might have come to a live stream in 2030, had we survived that long and not closed that particular congregation, doing more classroom work and education work and meeting work and group work online more seriously, which we wouldn't have done until later. And so when I think about hybrid ministry, what I want you to all think about is a trajectory of using the tools that we have for the purpose that the church has always had, and to do it well, and always ask the question, is this best done physically on the ground when we're in the same place together? Is this best done digitally, online, where we can all be in the same place using technology together, but we don't have to use gas to get there and time to travel, and that environment might work better actually for this. And being strategic, that if you're going to do hybrid ministry well, your small group ministry will be changed, your leadership and council meetings and board meetings will be changed, your servant ministry will be changed, your worship ministry will be changed, how you use your building will be changed, all these things will be changed. But then in a sense, and that's why we wrote the book that we did, every committee, team, or thing in your church should be thinking, how are we going to use technology in this new day? And can we improve how we've worked before by taking it seriously? So keep that in mind. Hybrid ministry isn't worship online. It includes that, but it's really how do we use the skills and technologies we have best to make our church as a congregation the most effective it can be? Here's some other things we know. Physical gatherings as they resume will be smaller, and that looks permanent. This is terrifying for people. I'm starting to have coaching calls from pastors who are now stressed that they realize that a lot of people, even now that they're back and have the vaccine, and this is happening on my side, I have people who have 2 vaccines, full immunity built in terms of what they're going to get. They're still not coming back. They're still using online. And they're nervous about bringing it to a grandchild that they watch, or it's just more convenient and they prefer it. Or in our case, we've done enough good work. I think actually our online worship flows more naturally and smoothly than our physical worship, if we're honest. There's a lot of reasons why people won't come back. And then 22% of people in our churches, according to the numbers, 22% of people have not been to online worship or physical worship since the pandemic, which is now like 15 months. So almost a quarter of our people have become functionally unchurched or dechurched. And if we don't engage those people, if you wait for those people to come back, you're going to wait a long time and you'll be very depressed. So thinking about finding out who those people are and engaging those people, phone calls, visits, emails, text messages, home visits when you've got your vaccine, go knock on the door and talk on the porch. There's going to be an incredible amount of people work required to reclaim community in a lot of places. And the larger your church system is, the more likely that this percentage will be higher. The smaller your church system is, the more likely it'll be a little lower. But we do know that less people are going to physically attend, and that online for many people has become not just comfortable, but preferential and useful in some ways that are amazing. I've got a woman, her name's Ellie. She's an amazing woman. She just turned 87. She had all kinds of health issues with cancer and the like. And we brought her in to record the Advent wreath piece for one of our worship services for Advent during December. And she said to me, Pastor Dave, I'm just wish that we'd had this. You remember when I was back in 2013, she said, and I had all those health things. I missed more church that summer. I just wish we'd had this then. And she talked about that. And she said that in 2013, she was in the hospital a lot. She's an every week attender. She's a person who tithes her income to the church. She is deeply committed and deeply involved in service, cooking for homeless and hungry people and all kinds of things. But that summer, she was out with health things, with cancer, and she had a lot of work and had to be done. And she missed more church, as she said, than in 20 years. And she realized that now that she's watching church online on an iPad, this is an 87-year-old woman who learned to use Zoom and Facebook Live and all the rest so that she could do this, realized if this had happened 7 years sooner, her summer would have been radically different and her connection to church would have been improved. Now think about that, an 87-year-old woman who, as a result of something she learned and experienced during a pandemic, which was just terrible things, said, if only the church had figured this out 10 years sooner, it would have made such a difference to me. That really touched my heart with a reminder that we really have, as the church, we owe it to the community, to that inward development of people, to not just do what we have to do to get by and to survive, but to be proactive, that we can do things before we have to because we get to and because it's a good idea. So I see if your only concern is staying in touch with shut-ins, online ministry and technical ability to go beyond those old cassette tapes that we used to pass out to bring people a copy of the sermon or something is so available. And 87-year-old people can figure this out with a little help, that we owe it to the church and to the world to do a better job. The other thing here that's going to be so important is relationships are going to be key, that the vitality of a congregation will not be ultimately tested by its ability to use technology well, but to develop relationships well. And that means that when people are engaging in online worship or online meetings, you still have to be maybe more attentive to connecting people to people. And that the incarnation really says that sometimes you're going to need to be in the same room. And that's not just a good thing, it's part of the essence of who we are. So with that in mind, one of the people that I track, some of you may be familiar with, but I urge you to at least read his blogs once in a while, Kerry Newhoff. He said this in a workshop that I attended with him. He said, a lot of people use online to get people to come to the building. In other words, the yellow pages kind of thing. It's a billboard, it's an advertisement. In the future, pastors will use the building to reach people online. In other words, we have to turn our mindset around from the old, let's post news on Facebook about Christmas Eve services, maybe somebody will come to church, to what are we going to do in this place to reach people where they are? And many of them are online. And so this is kind of a mindset reversal. It's not just a technical challenge, it's an adaptive challenge to our own mentality about this. Are we able to reframe ourselves not as an attractional people, waiting for people to come to us and using all the tools we have to attract them, but as a sent people, using the vehicles we have to move from where we are to where people are, whether that's a donut and coffee shop down the street or it's an online environment. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about worship, and I'm going to stop just for a second, Craig, before I get into pieces here. And are there any questions or pieces? Anybody like to just pop in with a question? Probably put them in the chat section real quick. If you've got a question or a comment on anything we've done during this first piece, because really this is a kind of a broad swath that I'm talking about, reframing your whole mindset. And that piece of going where you need to go and being who you need to be really doesn't change. It's just the fact that now we can go so many more places than we used to. And we owe it to ourselves and to Christ, out of gratitude for all that God has done, to try and go those places and to do that work. We got any comments or questions? You don't have to have them, but if you have them, I think it's a good spot. All right.
We do have one. Do you see this, Stephen? A couple are coming in. Or Dave, I mean, from Stephen Larson. As you move toward worship as a topic, please offer some comments and resources about online Eucharist.
Well, I wrote a paper on online Eucharist from a Lutheran perspective. And I know not everybody here is Lutheran, but the basic theology that I had on online Eucharist would be this. I worked through all the things from at least my perspective theologically, and I think relatively progressively. I think online Eucharist is fine theologically, and I don't particularly care for it practically. So my personal perspective is if you do things theologically well, that online Eucharist can be practiced and can be done well. Now I've seen, and I tend to watch, I've been watching 2 or 3 worship services besides my own every week since the pandemic started. So I've probably watched or scanned through in some significant ways 150 congregations or more. Big ones, non-denominational ones, ELCA Lutheran ones, small ones, consortiums and clusters doing things. So I've watched Methodist and United Church of Christ and all kinds of different things. And I will continue to do that for a while longer. I've seen some horrific stuff. I heard one pastor say online about communion, we're gonna have communion now, make sure you have some bread and something to drink. Wine or juice is what we usually use, but if you don't, make sure you have a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, that'll be fine. And I thought that kind of a mindset for me just doesn't set well. We're not element focused in communion because we're Christ focused, but I think disregarding elements, protocol, and those things, that kind of glibness about it really bothered me. So I've seen a lot of, we're gonna have communion now, so it's time to eat the bread. No explanation of Christ's presence or any theological work. And I think we don't do a good job. It makes me mindful of the fact that, to be honest, we do a crappy job on the ground of explaining what Eucharist is mostly. If you had a visitor, they wouldn't know what was happening, because most of the time we don't say that as we eat this bread and drink this cup, we trust that Christ is truly here with us in this room, that worship is incarnational, and that we gather not to raise praises to a God who watches from up here, but to worship a God who comes into our midst in the middle. So I think we do a bad job on the ground, but online it becomes all the more clear because you have no idea who's watching and participating. The second thing I read that I thought was interesting was from a Catholic priest who quoted a Native American leader who said, "We never film smudging rites." And you'll never see a film of sweat lodges inside, because these are spiritual things. They're things you participate in, you don't watch. and that they're holy and sacred. So I'm rather cognizant of the fact that it's easy when you make things easy to lose the sense of sacredness or uniqueness of something. And I've seen that all too often. At the same time, I think it's possible for a group of people, particularly on Zoom, but I've used a recorded liturgy once and Zoom twice. We've had communion 3 times online since the pandemic in my church: Christmas, Ash Wednesday, and Maundy Thursday. We're very clear about it being communal. And if you use any kind of recorded material and stuff, I think you should take it down when you're done, that either you participated in it while it was happening, it was a genuine communal event, or you don't. So I don't think you should leave recordings of Eucharist up and say, well, if you're watching next Thursday, just grab some bread and you can commune too. Because I don't think the communal dimension works that way. So I think it can be done theologically, and I think it can be done practically well. I will say I've personally, and maybe it's because I'm 60, and I've got my own creativity and excitement about things and my own baggage and history about things. It's a kind of a mix. I don't find it particularly satisfying experience compared to being in the room with people. And so I think the fact that you can do something doesn't always mean you should, and that we all need to use our good judgment on this as we proceed. So that would be maybe enough on Eucharist, at least for me. It's only one person's perspective anyway, and the Conference of Bishops has in the LCA a much wider perspective, and is sort of kind of cowered on the whole topic of not saying don't do it or do it anymore, because there's a lot of them who think we should be doing it routinely, and a lot of them who think it's a heresy to even contemplate it. So the ELCA's lack of unity on this has produced a don't ask, don't tell policy on communion. And I think we're just sort of stuck with that, which I don't want to get into that, but I think it's a leadership void there that should have been spoken to better. Any other things you see, Craig, and questions?
Yeah, 3 really good topics, and you can see if you want to do them now or save them. One is, what about Zoom fatigue when people work or study online and now there's more? The second is how to make online space more gracious. And the third is a really great one: as folks come back to church who might live in other states, what does that now mean for pastoral care and other things like that? And I think I'm hearing that's happening a lot, that folks are now saying, oh, I can be a part of Gethsemane Lutheran Church. I live in Chicago, about the churches in Minneapolis where I used to live, and how great that I can be part of that church now. Take your pick.
Yeah, let's do those, because when we do the smaller group later, we can mess with some of these other topics and stuff. Let's deal with these questions because they're good ones. Zoom fatigue, I think, is very real. I think it's also a red herring for people, in that once we get to a hybrid reality, and we're starting to get back to it, I've had people who had meeting fatigue before pandemic, and they just had too many physical meetings. I worked for the church-wide office for 8 years, and it was like one meeting after another meeting after another meeting. And so meeting fatigue in general is a reality, whether you're meeting in a room together or online. And I think Zoom fatigue is a pandemic-driven reality because we can only meet in one environment. And there is more work to Zoom in some ways, and there's less work in others. Obviously, the nice thing is that I'm teaching a class in Chicago today. Not all of you are in the seminary. You didn't have to drive to the seminary. I didn't have to drive to the seminary, which is about an hour and 15-minute drive for me during rush hour. I won't have to drive home. It saved me 2.5 hours today. So I can grumble that I'm tired for having 3 hours on Zoom, but I don't have to grumble about 2.5 hours of commuting, which is also exhausting. So, I think you have to be objective about the fact that you might be tired of Zoom, but you're picking up some other bonus points someplace else. And I think if we look at our reality, even during the pandemic, Zoom fatigue is real, but it's also true that we're picking up some other pieces, and people have had more free time during the pandemic in other ways as a result of not commuting. The second thing I would say about Zoom fatigue is access is really important for people. And I have a lot of people, particularly when you start thinking parish ministry. Remember, not everybody in your parish has the same kind of a work environment that pastors or seminary students are living in right now. So, for example, I have people who've been essential workers, and they're not on Zoom all day. They're working in a factory, or they're working in a place of business, or they're in a doctor's office, or they're a nurse in a hospital, or lots of things. So while a lot of us who are especially more white collar or student based at the moment are Zoom fatigue because we're doing all our stuff. A lot of the people that you're working with are not spending their days on Zoom at near the levels that many of us are. And when they get home from working in a factory, or they get home from working in the hospital and they've not been on Zoom, and you say, well, now I'm kind of Zoom fatigued. I think we should meet at the church. I'd like you to drive 45 minutes to be there by 7. And I know you get off work at 5. You don't get home till 5 or 6, and you have to leave home by 6:15 if you're going to make it to the meeting at 7. But I'm kind of Zoom fatigued. I think we should meet physically. The reality is that you create commute fatigue and burnout and all kinds of other things in people who are living already in a hybrid world, not an only digital world. So as the pandemic wanes, which it will in some way or shape or form, we're going to have increasing options for physical and Zoom and other things. And so I think that will diminish too. If you're not doing everything on Zoom in kind of an educational world or a white collar world where you're doing a lot of things in meetings, a Zoom meeting can be very refreshing. If you think, boy, I could meet at 7 and stay home and I've been gone all day, or I could meet at 7 and drive someplace again. You might find that Zoom fatigue is a long gone thing, and the joy of having a Zoom meeting on a Tuesday night instead of having to drive back to that building could also be a relief. So put that in context. You had another question about something, Craig. What was that?
One is how to make the gift of facilitation and making online meetings full of grace and hospitality and that gift. How to do that.
Yeah, well, I did I actually did a whole workshop on Zoom meetings for the church-wide staff because people were burning out on them. And I think one thing to do, one of the things that you lose in Zoom is chit chat. It's one of the blessings. You can mute everybody, and if people want to have a side conversation, they're just stuck not having it. Whereas I grew up in New York, and a little snide comment to the person next to me or something during meetings is just kind of normal. It's how I entertain myself in a boring meeting. And so there's actually a certain graciousness in Zoom in that it requires you to pay attention if you're willing to, because you don't have as many things to not pay attention to as long as you're willing to engage the meeting. Those kind of side to side. The second thing to think about is a workshop like this where we've got, dozens of people and you can't see. In a normal meeting, if you have, let's say, 8 people, there's a lot of evidence right now that especially for small groups and especially for new people in small groups, Zoom is a much more gracious environment than having to come to a new group and meet face to face. It's very anxiety producing to knock on somebody's door for a small group in a home you've never been to, or to come to a church that you're new to and sit with 7 people in a group that you've never met. In Zoom, I'm sitting in my office here, right? And it looks like I'm kind of a professional. If I turned it around, it looks like I'm a slob because you can see big stacks of books to be mailed and stuff. But I can control my environment here and present myself in a pretty comfortable way. And so a new person doesn't have turfiness. So a lot of things can be done better on Zoom. If you look at, move your cursor right now, I'm looking at Pastor Carlene. I can see Pastor Carlene. She just smiled when I said her name. I can see that on Zoom. I don't know who Pastor Carlene is, but I know her name already because in Zoom, everybody wears a name tag. And the reality is, in a new meeting, churches sometimes are pathetic. And if I got a hearing issue, I might not have heard whether you said it was Wanda or Juanita or whatever. And so those kind of things might be more gracious than you think. The other thing is be sure to do check-ins. And a good facilitator, if you know the people, introduce people graciously. One of the things I've learned is if you know something about people and you're going around, say something gracious about them as you start. If I knew Carlene better and I knew something about her life, maybe she knits or she cooks or she does woodwork or I don't know what she does, and I knew that, and maybe I'd say to her as I did that, tell us about the woodworking project you're working on, or tell us, have you knit anything interesting? That you can create personalness by knowing people and asking them to share something personal as part of that. But I do think it's possible to be gracious. The other thing is be a little gracious with your environment. Green screen backgrounds can be horrific. I know they're nice because they can kind of hide your clutter or make you look like you're at a beach or something. But a lot of times, if you don't have a good green screen system, people's ears disappear and their arms, when they move, they come and go. It's very distracting. It's actually quite tiring. So those backgrounds, if you're using them, make sure they work. They do make a green screen that you can clip on the back of your chair that actually makes a green screen so that your picture will show up better without going in and out so much. But be conscious of what you're presenting, because you can be tiring to people yourself. So presenting yourself in a gracious way can help. But I think facilitators just need to talk to people, give time for interaction. Keep it tight, but don't go straight to business always either, because the best thing about a meeting sometimes is the 10 minutes before when it got started, because people can catch up, and the 5 minutes after. It's where breakout rooms can also help. We had the best congregational meeting we had ever had this year, and it was considered very informative and very gracious because it was online. And we just put people in breakout rooms and have 2 questions to talk about. Don't put them in breakout rooms and say, just chat with each other for 10 minutes. A lot of people can't figure out what to talk about. But come up with 2 or 3 things to talk about, put them in a breakout room, let them talk. A lot of people, especially during this pandemic time, have found that they're just hungry for conversations with people that they haven't seen for a while. And we had people at the end of our hour-and-a-half Zoom congregational meeting say that was the best meeting ever. And what they really meant was that the information was shared in meaningful ways because of the chat and the thing they could hear better than ever before. And they really liked the breakout room where they got to talk to somebody about something that wasn't on the agenda, but just something interesting or fun about their life. So those are a few tips I would start with. Anything else, Craig?
Sure. Do you want to keep going with questions?
Well, let me just say, because I see it's 5 of, and I don't know how we're going to break all this time up, but I do want to say that, this Zoom fatigue question raises another question for me. I think we have an ethical responsibility to not put all of our ministry back on the ground when we're finished. I think it's a moral issue, not just even a practical one. I've got a young woman in our congregation. Her name's Danny. And Danny just had her 2nd child like a week ago, Jonathan Andrew. And she sent me a text message because I was actually out of the state when it happened, because we were on a vacation in the Ozarks. And I got a message that she'd had her child, and she sent me a text message, said, I want to talk to you pretty soon about having Jonathan baptized. And all of it happened using technology, right? Phone, text message, all the rest. It was all hybrid ministry in the sense that we wouldn't have thought about it that way before, but we haven't been in the same space yet. And I didn't visit her in the hospital when she gave birth. It wasn't practical. It wasn't a recommended idea. And she actually didn't want me there because of the pandemic and everything else. She just thought it was fine to make a phone call. But one of the neat things that I learned from Danny is Danny had never been to a midweek Bible study educational opportunity at church in her entire adult life. The reason is she lives in a place called Hampshire, which is west of Elgin, about 25, 30 minutes. She works in a place called Schaumburg, which is east of Elgin, about 25 or 30 minutes. She has an hour commute to work. She has an hour commute home. She has a 3-year-old. She was pregnant. Her husband has some disability issues with circulation issues that have come about in his legs. And it's just totally ridiculous for her to think at Tuesday night, if we were doing something, that she could find her way from Schaumburg out to Hampshire, deal with the stuff she's got to deal with as a mom and a spouse and all the rest, and come back in to church, which is another 30 minutes in the car, do whatever she's going to do, and then come back, and she gets home after her kids are supposed to have been in bed. It's just, it's actually kind of cruel to even suggest that she contemplates such a thing. And so we never did, and she never did, and she never did. But now that it's online, 7 o'clock at 6:59, she can turn her computer on and she can be there. And what was interesting was she didn't miss very many. She went to a lot of things. And so for her, this opened up a whole new opportunity. I mean, she's in church every Sunday. She actually is one of our nursery attendant people and works with kids. So for her, church is very important. And she's, in that sense, an unusual young adult in that she's decided that church and family are critical things. And you all know the statistics on young people in church. But she had never been involved in a weekday thing. If we decide now we can meet back in person, we should all be back in person. What we're basically saying is, Danny, it was nice that we had a pandemic so you could participate, but now that we can go back, we don't really give a rip. You should drive or skip it. No, we owe it to people like Danny to say, we can do this better. Now, does that mean we do them online? Yes. Does it mean that we equip some of our classrooms with webcams and big TVs so somebody could choose to participate Zoom in a hybrid environment while others participate in the same room? And you maybe have an option that you can be at church at 7 if you want. You can be home at 7 if you want. You decide? Maybe. Does that cost money? Yeah. Does it require rethinking? Absolutely. Is it right to tell Danny that you no longer can continue to grow and develop as a disciple in this church because we're not going to do something because it's not the way we used to do it and now we can do it the old way again? Who would say that that's a good decision? Nobody, I hope. So to me, it's really it's an ethical issue. But once you have the capacity to do this better, you can't go back and say, well, it's a lot easier the other way. I mean, you have to use that as a base because resources and time and capacity are all important. But the reality is, once you get into something and do it better, it's often easier to do it better long-term because it produces more fruit, better participation, more engagement, a lot of things. It's like anything else. The transition is often difficult and often stress-producing. But the transition, if it brings a new stability, if you will, whatever that means, in some new ways, provides incredible ways to do discipleship and partnership and convening people and worship access and all kinds of things. So, Craig, I know it's 10 here, and I think the first group, we said we'd do an hour. I'll stay with people as long as you choose, however you want to break the time up. But I want to also honor your schedule and your leadership here. So I'm going to defer to you here.
So a couple of things. There are some folks asking about both the PowerPoint and the recording. So we are recording it, and I'll work with Dave and LSTC regarding those two questions, and hopefully we'll see what he says about releasing those, unless you'd like to speak now.
Oh, if you're on this and you get a copy of the recording, you can certainly watch it, and I'll be glad to send the slides. I'll do a PDF of the whole slide. I've got a 3-hour slide deck here. I did a 3-hour workshop on this for the Presbytery of Vancouver, Canada, about a month ago, and this is the slide deck base is mostly from that group, and I'll put that together in a PDF slide deck thing so you can have it as a handout. And Craig, you can work with Jan on just getting that. Anybody who's on this session is welcome to have a hand of all the slides, including ones we didn't look at, and this recording. It's fine with me.
So here's, I think, what we can do in the next hour with students. We were going to be taking questions anyway. So I think I'm willing to go till 10:10, and then we'll take our break and come back. And those of you that need to leave, please feel free to do that. And thanks for coming today. But we're going to try to cover these other two good questions as we can, related to ministry, online ministry now with folks who live in a different city, and what that particularly, I guess, would mean for pastoral care or communion, for example, based on what you said. The other one that I think would be good is this one. If you could share your opinion, the best case scenario for online worship in terms of online and in-person interaction, streaming platform, Facebook versus Zoom, interaction and hospitality with guests. So those of you who are wondering if you would like to stay for the next 2 minutes, I'm proposing those two questions. One is, what about folks now who are in a different city? And the second has to do with platforms and interaction between these in-person and online communities. Dave, do those sound okay?
Those are great, and both excellent questions in terms of topics, because they're really big ones. I'll try and do like 5 minutes on each, maybe, because I think they're both huge topics. We could spend an hour on either of them. Start with worship. The best platform for online worship is the one that works best for you. And I say that meaningfully. We started out, I'll just tell you our story and where we're at. We started out on March 15th last year was my first Sunday back from sabbatical. I had a January, February sabbatical. March 15th was my first Sunday back. It was the last Sunday we physically worshiped. And probably we were iffy about it. Attendance was kind of mediocre. We really wanted to, but the state went into all the shutdown modes like the 17th, 18th. So I came back for 1 week. We knew we were going to do that. We started online worship that week because I was at least alert to the fact that the 22nd, we might not be able to do it. I took my laptop on a little TV tray table in the center aisle. I opened the laptop lid up and I pushed the live button on Facebook Live. And we just did it because we had no idea. I used to be an engineer. And I know a lot about technology, but I actually had no idea how well what I had would function in what kinds of space. So we broadcast out to our Facebook page to nobody who knew it was coming. I mean, like, I'm sure some people found it, but we didn't broadcast. We're going to have online worship this week. So we basically did a service with nobody watching. And then we watched it and said, wow, did that suck? That was just bad. But it was really important. You have to be critical. I mean, you have to say, boy, that was really bad. And so the next week we moved worship from the sanctuary to the narthex because it had a better acoustics for what we had. And we got an external mic to put onto it. And we were able to, with an electric keyboard and things, do a much better job. So the first week we were actually online, we live streamed and we did better. We were having a lot of problems, so we had to up our internet speed. So we had to change our contract because your upload speeds have to be adequate to get things going. We eventually decided that long-term live streaming, we bought a new camera. Currently we're using a system called Mevo, M-E-V-O, which is a single camera panoramic lens with a software-based zoom system. So it looks like a multi-camera setup if somebody will work with it. And we've been using that now since last April. But we went from live stream to recorded over the summer. We just decided there were too many glitches. We could do better. So we've been recording and editing. So we record the sermon, we record the children's sermon, we record the prayers, we have a peace song that we do, hymns and liturgy. Our choirs come in and sang pieces with masks. We put stuff together and then we edit a service, and it takes about probably 2 hours of recording time for everything in a week, and probably 5 to 6 hours of editing time a week. So it takes about 8 hours of time, some of that labor. And I was doing that. We're now contracting with somebody who's the son of somebody in our congregation who's up in Mankato, Minnesota. And I upload library things to him. He does stuff, sends it back. I do the final edit and put my sermon and children's sermons and prayers in to contextualize for the week, because you can't do everything. Now that we're coming back, it's pretty clear that we have 2 on the ground services. And then we have the recorded service separate. So we have 8:30 live, 9:30 live, Facebook live, but it's a recorded live release premiere, and 10:45. The amount of time it takes for me as a half-time pastor and a labor pool that we have just doesn't work. So we're starting a tech team this week, and we're going to put in probably a 2-camera PTZ pan tilt zoom system with a software piece. And we're probably going to have to spend $5,000 to get that back up, because what worked during the pandemic isn't going to be practical for us not when the pandemic's over and we have to be hybrid again. During the pandemic, we weren't hybrid for the most part. Our worship was only online. So I tell that to you because you have to decide, why are we doing this? Are we doing this to reach people in Asia and Africa, and we're going to have a global presence? Look at your stuff. Are we going to do this to be good connections for the shut-ins and the people who are peripheral around our ministry because of snowbirds or whatever? Do stuff. Think about why you're doing it and what's there. I think most congregations should have an online presence, but think about who it's for, the amount of resources you have available, and how you can do it well. If it's schlocky and bad, just don't do it. It'd be better to have something not there than to have something bad. And then the best platform is the one that will allow you to do it well. And we're going to go from recorded back to live stream for most of our regular worship, which is a new setup. And we'll have to have a tech person running 2 cameras and video switching and stuff in the back to do it. But we won't have to do anything when we're finished. When the 8:30 service is live streamed at 9:30, we're done. I don't have 8 hours of editing and all the other stuff to do. So I really think labor is a huge question. And who it's for. People got all excited. Oh, we had 3,000 people for Easter. Well, we're starting to look at real numbers now, long-term, without the pandemic and the like. And there's an incredibly important audience out there. But think about who it is, who it's for, and what you need to do it well to serve those people and to reach new people. And it might not be that the answer you chose for September last year is the one you want to use September this year, because the context is changing again, and being nimble is important. The other question, Craig, you had was about, remind me.
Folks who live outside the city.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I think this is probably one of the places where Northern churches will really reap the rewards of online ministry. For example, I'm serving at Holy Trinity Elgin as an interim, and the vice president of that church retired this year. And it's his first year going to Florida. And it was a pandemic year. And so he worshiped online in Florida anyway. So where did he worship? He worshiped at Holy Trinity all winter. And when he's on the vice president of council, he came to every council meeting. He didn't miss a council meeting. He could be an officer and still participate. So I think that one thing that's going to change for Northern churches is that, especially young retirees who haven't built up a habit of going to another physical congregational location, a lot of people who are snowbirds in Arizona, Texas, Florida, in Northern places like Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the northern states, are going to find that their snowbird participation benefits dramatically from staying connected to their home congregation up north because of online ministry. I think that if you have an online presence and are a northern church with a lot of snowbirds, you will keep connections with those people better. They'll be likely to be able to continue to participate in leadership roles and in activities that are online, particularly if you cultivate online hybrid. And to be honest, they're more likely to not put offerings in other church plates, but your own. So they're likely to stay connected, and their stewardship is likely to stay connected. If they see themselves as belonging to two congregations, their stewardship is likely to. So for those snowbird dynamics, I think Northern congregations will find much higher linkages to people who are gone for 2 or 3 months in the wintertime, staying connected to that home congregation. The other dynamic is when people move. And this one's fascinating. I've got a member of my church council from last year who moved to St. Louis area, lives in outside of Florissant, Missouri, and still participates in church in Elgin, Illinois every week, because he and his wife haven't looked for another congregation, and it was digital anyway. And why go online with digital that you don't know people when you could be online with digital that you do know people? So the fact that they're in St. Louis is almost irrelevant, because it's not, St. Louis and Elgin aren't places on the internet. Internet's its own meeting place now. Remember, it's not, it's actually a location. I've got another person that moved from my congregation just a block away, could walk to church, and instead moved to Rockford, which is about 45, 50 miles away. Was participating in a spiritual practices class that my wife teaches on Thursday morning. Still comes every Thursday to spiritual practices class, still worshiping online, but has a child, an adult child who's got some health issues and needed some reference and help. So I had to connect them to a pastor in the Rockford area who I thought could actually give them help for on the ground physical ministry. But her basic wiring is not to join a church in Rockford, but to stay participating in a church in Elgin. So I think those are going to be huge issues, particularly when you start talking about, we're not likely to do a lot of online communion experiences, but probably keep most of our communion experience on the ground, at least in our case. That doesn't mean you have to do that. So I think it raises huge issues. If you only participate in a digital environment, what do you gain on access and what do you lose in terms of incarnation? And that'll vary. But I do see ministry really spreading out and geography being pretty wide. Probably should stop there.
Dave, I'm like the newscaster who says we have 1 minute, but the specifics that a couple folks wanted to hear is, what about pastoral care when somebody's in a hospital?
Oh, you mean if they're out of town?
Yeah, they're in another town and they've chosen they don't have a pastor there, and suddenly now something happens and you can't have on the ground pastoral care.
Okay, well, I would say 2 things are important. One, I think using our network, if I was this lady in Rockford, for example, had somebody in the hospital, I would probably, because it's 40 or 50 miles away, it's really important, I probably could go. I could probably call a couple of colleagues I know there and say, could you do it? I could also use the hospital chaplain system. Also, because they're technically inclined in using technology. To be honest, I'm finding a lot of people are happy with a FaceTime visit. It's very interesting that depending on the degree of severity, if somebody's in the hospital for gallbladder removal and it's not life-threatening, and it's 50 miles away, using the phone and saying, hey, I just wanted to pray with you, or doing a video call seems to be actually more than adequate. If it's a more serious issue or the person's older and they value pastoral presence more, then you have a much bigger issue. And I actually don't know how to solve that one, except through collegiality and making somebody else go do a visit, that's in the area because they're a colleague. Say, could you go visit Mrs. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so? They're in the hospital and it's 100 miles for me to drive there. Would you go see them? And just being willing to help each other. But I think that's a huge dilemma. Pastoral care, especially for older people with serious, end of life issues, when distance is a reality and technology's there, I don't have an answer for that one completely. I'll just be honest.
There are other questions, but we're all going to be living into these questions gradually and seeking answers within us, with others, with consultants over the next months and years. So first of all, let's give a very warm Zoom thank you to Dave Daubert for being with us today and his wisdom and experience. We are now going to say goodbye to those of you who joined us for this special forum today, and administration, class, and guests. We will be returning in 10 minutes at 10:24. All right, blessings and bye to many of you.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.